And joining me in the studio right now is India's former ambassador to the United States, Arun Singh, who's been tracking the story very closely as well. Good evening, Ambassador. Pleasure to have you here again. We're hearing a lot of how, this is going to strain ties between the United States and its European allies, France, Britain, Germany. But really speaking, what sort of power do these allies really wield over the United States?
What is different on this occasion is that three major European countries, UK, France and Germany, have come together to issue a joint statement expressing regret, concern at the decision that President Trump has taken. That having been said, there have been occasions in the past when one or the other European country did not agree with the US decision, but there were divisions among the European countries. For example, when US invaded Iraq in 2003, UK fully supported the US, while France and Germany were not comfortable with the US decision. So US has exploited divisions that exist within Europe while pursuing what it wants to do. So in this case, that's certainly one aspect which is different. But that having been said, compared to the US power and influence in the world, the European countries, even if they come together, do not quite match that influence. And they have a certain dependence on the US also because of the challenge that they see from Russia in the European context. And they certainly do not have the military power and nuclear capacity to really stand up to Russia. So they need US as an ally in that context.
Sure.
And then there are the frontline countries in Eastern Europe, Poland and others, who again depend heavily on the US for their own guarantees. Therefore, beyond a point, European countries are not really in a position to fully stand up to the US and take a position that is stridently different. But although in this case, they certainly believe that from their point of view, the US decision is something that they're not comfortable with.
Okay, and what I'm getting from you also is that this highlights a worrying trend of, one country wielding immense power over the dictate, so to speak, of how, global economies are run. But what's the antidote, in your opinion, to America's disproportionate power, if you will?
Well, one of the things that not just India but many other countries talk about is multipolarity in international relations. And it is only when the world is multipolar that people come together in a multilateral context to arrive at consensus decisions. But when there is disproportionate power, then one country really wields influence. And some of the most negative decisions that emerged from the US after 1990, for example, invasion of Iraq or what happened in Yugoslavia, all that happened when it was a unipolar world in a very significant way. And the other countries did not paled in comparison to the US power and influence. Therefore, the real antidote, I would say, is twofold. One, everybody needs to work to cultivate the alternative voice within the US, because President Trump's decision has been criticized also within the US, the opposition voices within the US. So those alternative voices, of course, need to be cultivated. And in the international context, you have to look at building multipolarity in a medium and longer term context. That's really the only antidote.
The other big meeting or big foreign policy, a development that everyone's keeping track of course, is the Trump Kim Jong-un meet, which is expected to take place next month. Do you see today's decision negatively impacting, I should say, that meeting, the prospect of it even happening? Because, Kim Jong-un would be a worried man following what's happened as far as the JCPOA goes.
Among analysts, I find that there is divided opinion on that subject. Some believe that what President Trump has done with Iran may make a deal with North Korea more complicated, because North Korea could very well think that if there is no sanctity to an international agreement that US has entered into, and not just President Trump but the president after him goes back on any agreement that is negotiated, then with what confidence do you enter into any agreement? And North Korea has had that experience earlier. President Clinton had worked out some arrangement with North Korea on the nuclear issue. But when President Bush was elected, he went back on that. And therefore, the attempt at denuclearization in the Korean context that had taken place in the 90s didn't work out after 2000. So that they've had that experience. So certainly that would be a factor. The alternative argument is that through this, President Trump is signaling to North Korea that the kind of deal that Iran got is something that you should not expect. Because I would certainly be looking for a far stronger deal.
Right.
And therefore, he's laying the base for that. Now, whether that will really work in the North Korean context, if the US expects an immediate and early denuclearization right at the start of the process rather than during the process or at the end of the process, that many people argue is not a very realistic expectation. But we have to see, because President Trump's argument is that his approach of a very firm posture accompanied by economic sanctions has worked in the North Korean context, and I think what they're trying to do is later go back in the Iranian context with what they believe has succeeded in the North Korean context. But whether it will succeed in the Iranian context, because Iran is a different country.
Absolutely.
It has tremendous pride in its own civilizational heritage. It has certain strength. It will look for its partners, its relationships with Russia, China.
But is Mr. Rouhani strong enough domestically at this point in time to sort of risk any sort of engagement with the United States? I ask because, you know, we've seen large protests against Rouhani despite the fact that he was re-elected. There have been rumors of how even the spiritual leader, how Khamenei is, you know, building support against Rouhani. Does he find himself in a far less powerful position today than perhaps a year ago?
He's certainly been very weakened as a result of this, because it was Rouhani, according to most reports, who had pushed and taken the initiative to continue with the dialogue process and negotiations with the US and eventually work out the agreement. He had been opposed by hardliners within Iran who are opposed to any kind of a compromise with the United States. That's their ideological position. Now, having worked out an agreement, and even the agreement didn't work out too well for Iran, because although they met all their obligations, the kind of sanction relief they expected from the US didn't take place, especially after the new administration came into power. So he has been criticized for that. Now that the US has gone back on the agreement, there will be further criticism. Therefore, for him to get into negotiations with the US again will not be easy. Therefore, if you saw what President Rouhani said in his televised comment, he's really saying that he will go back to the European countries, to Russia and China, to ask them to live up to their part of the bargain. And if they live up to their part of the bargain, then Iran will remain in the deal. So I think the real test now is of the European countries, Russia and China, whether they are able to stay with the agreement that they have negotiated. And not only did they negotiate it, they had taken it to the UN Security Council.
Absolutely.
And the UN Security Council had endorsed that agreement. So therefore the agreement has international validity. So it can be argued that although US has taken a unilateral decision, US is technically in violation of an international agreement that has been authorized by the UN Security Council.
And that's not the first time it's happening either. I mean, we've seen the US thumb its nose at international accords, Paris climate change for one. This seems to be the latest in President Trump's foreign policy initiative, while keeping his domestic audience clearly in mind. We leave it at that, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your perspective with us. We'll, of course, be keeping track of whether the apple cart is going to be upturned by President Trump's decision when it comes to not just the European countries and Iran, but also the impact it's going to have on countries like India.